as we continue our journey through the minds and body, and we discuss the rings and Twin Peaks Fire with me. That was weird, wasn't it? Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are, this series, looking at the mind and body in horror cinema, and this is part 14, in which we're looking at two weird and wonderful films from the minds of Cronenberg and Lynch. Dead Ringers from 1988 and Fire Walk With Me from 1992. Now, I want to say a big spoiler warning here. Obviously, as ever, we will be discussing both these movies in depth, so we will be spoiling these films, but I also want to say a big fat spoiler alert for the TV show Twin Peaks. Now, of course, Fire Walk With Me was the film that came after seasons 1 and 2 of the TV show, so there are details, major details in the TV show that are revealed and spoilt in this film. So if you haven't seen Twin Peaks, but at some point you're considering watching Twin Peaks, I would avoid listening to our discussion on Fire Walk With Me because it kind of ruins the entire mystery of the TV show. But for everyone else coming with us on this journey, then please do enjoy. It's a big episode. There's a lot to discuss. Later on in this episode, I'll be joined by Anna Bogutskaya to discuss Fire Walk With Me. But first of all, a brand new guest joining me to discuss Cronenberg's Dead Ringers. Skyping in from the US of A, it is my great pleasure to welcome Kelli Weston. Hello, Kelli.
Hi.
Hi. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm surviving. How's lockdown life for you at the moment? You're over in the US, aren't you?
I'm in the US. It's slightly stressful. I should say that I'm very lucky, so I'm staying with my parents. But yeah, I think pandemic regulations are a bit lax, and that is, I think, yeah, I'm laughing, but it's a traumatic laugh. But basically, I am fine. I am also surviving.
Good. I'm trying to get myself a fun, like, kind of horror-themed face mask, because I keep seeing lots of people sporting, ones with, like, the Shining pattern on them, or a kind of Michael Myers face or something like that. I think that's what we all need to do, go and embrace our face masks.
Yeah, I think, horror fans have been prepared for this moment for a long time, so...
Yeah. I know, that's right. We're ready. We're so ready for this. So first of all, just tell us for a little bit about yourself. Tell us sort of what you do.
So I'm a film critic. I'm a film writer. I have written for a bunch of places like Film Comment, Hyperallergic. I've written for Sight and Sound. And yeah, I specialize in horror cinema. And it's a huge... It's been a central part of my life for a long time. I was thinking about this the other day because I know you had asked some questions about my relationship to horror. And I realized it's been a really formative part of my cinema education because those were some of the first films that I ever watched. So I didn't grow up necessarily in a cinephile family. But when I was a kid and I would be staying with my cousins, my older cousins, their siblings, usually, they were teenagers and they wanted to watch the things that they wanted to watch. Yes. And they really resented being asked to look after us anyway. So,
yeah.
It was kind of this is going to give you nightmares, but they didn't really try very hard to shield us from what they would watch. So when I was 8 or 9, I was watching Candyman and Scream.
Oh my God.
And yeah, really intense stuff. And I think that even though I went through this phase when I was about 13 or so, where I was I only watch independent films and international cinema, I was still sort of reading, that was when I sort of discovered, female Gothic literature. And so horror has been, I think, a massive part of my life for a really long time, basically.
Amazing. That's very cool. So I was going to ask you, do you remember what your first ever sort of horror film experience was?
I don't. I mean, in my mind, I remember the first time I watched Candyman, which was at my Aunt Cheryl's house. It was a sleepover, and their older sisters were watching us, and they wanted to watch Candyman. And I remember like the whole night, like it was just three little girls sort of like close to each other in bed, afraid to go to the bathroom. So, it was quite hectic and chaotic as they tried to like get to the I think that's the first one that I remember, but I'm sure like before that, there are things that I've suppressed. And so,
yeah. I mean, Candyman is terrifying, though, isn't it? Especially when you're young. How do you feel about the remake, the prospect of the upcoming Candyman remake?
Well, I'm really excited about it because, I think Candyman has been reclaimed of late as this sort of feminist text, and that may be true. I don't think it is particularly intersectional. So I think that it's a film that it sort of premises itself on being very racially and also in a gendered way very progressive. And actually, I think that Black women in that film don't get they're not treated very generously. So I'm excited that Nia DaCosta was going to be the director of this. That it was like being produced by Jordan Peele, who I love Get Out. I really love Us. I think a lot of people are very cool on Us or lukewarm, relatively anyway. But I'm a huge fan of the people making it. And most importantly, it is starring this actor called Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, who is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful man. It could be great. So I have very, very high expectations.
Amazing. I am really excited for it, actually. It's probably now the horror film I'm most excited for this year. And actually, well, hopefully it's this year, right? Because we don't know for certain. Halloween's just been pushed back at the time we're recording this. And I'm just like, I'm kind of dreading the news that Candyman is also going to get pushed back at some point, but hopefully not.
Just embrace. I mean, we were talking about this a little before. I think embrace VOD. We've been watching Netflix for many, many years now. I think we can handle it for this brief period of time.
I actually, this is probably sacrilege to say, but I think I prefer watching horror films at home to being in a cinema. I think they affect me more, they scare me more when I'm, on my own at home at night rather than in a cinema with hundreds of other people,
I completely agree. I think that obviously there are, sometimes a cinematic experience can turn out to be really rewarding. Like I've never regretted a single Peck'em-plex screening ever.
Oh,
but
yes.
I mean, like, needs must. So I think that, there are certain films that sort of lend themselves anyway to being watched at home, and horror films are definitely one of those. I mean, it's also great if you can like sort of watch a horror film in your home where horror films are often set. I think that also adds a dimension to it that people don't appreciate, and which is I find very thrilling, but I'm a weirdo, so
No, I 100% agree with you. So let me ask you a little bit about this like kind of quite niche area of horror that we call body horror, and particularly kind of the work of David Cronenberg, I suppose. What are your thoughts on that, on Cronenberg and on body horror?
So this is interesting because body horror is probably my least favorite of the subgenres. I'm crazy about it. And David Cronenberg is kind of like, if not, maybe it's a little too much to say that he like originated it, but he definitely pioneered it with, he did Blob, he did The Fly, and then he, Dead Ringers comes in 1988, 1987. And Dead Ringers was the first Cronenberg film that I ever saw. So, and this is just a bit of context, which may be interesting to no one. But when I was a child, again, we return to my youth, I was deeply, deeply in love with Jeremy Irons for some reason. And I don't know where this came from.
You're only human, Kelli. You're only human. Like, he's amazing.
Actor. Thank you for saying that, because, you know, many of my friends who may or may not listen to this find it extremely odd that I loved him. And so one of the films, like, this also went on for years. Like, I spent years, like, seeking out Jeremy Irons films, because I think it was, like, pre-Netflix or whatever. Maybe it was during Netflix, but when they were sending you DVDs and stuff. Mm-hmm. But I sought out, you know, his filmography that wasn't, like, readily accessible. Because weirdly enough, they always played, like, his worst films. Like, The House of Spirits came on television all the time, but I couldn't find, like, So Dead Ringers is the film that sort of introduced me to Cronenberg. And I think, weirdly, the films of his that I prefer are the films that are sort of more... He's been lately on this real sort of a much more... I mean, he's never really deviated from psychoanalysis. Like, he's always been very fascinated by the mind and how the mind sort of... how the tricks of the mind sort of manifest in the body. And I think that's really fascinating. But around the time that I think I discovered Dead Ringers probably was around his sort of, you know, history of violence period and, like, Eastern Promises. So those were the Cronenberg films that I was drawn to. And I love Dead Zone, but yeah, his body horror films, I've never seen The Fly. I've seen images from The Fly, and I think I'm good.
Right? Yeah. So what is it? Are you just not good with kind of that kind of gross, squishy gore stuff?
Yes, and I think I guess we'll get into it the more we talk about Dead Ringers, but yeah, my favorite kind of horror is haunted house. I love ghost stories. I'm pretty superstitious, so this is I don't know why, but body horror is something. It's where I draw the line, and I think, you know, I also used to draw the line at possessions and, like, demon shit, and so I think that those things probably go together. That I'm not crazy about corporeal horror, because I think that's maybe a little too visceral.
Yeah, fair enough. I think I'm okay with kind of, weirdly, I'm okay with sort of splattery gore that you might see in a slasher film.
Yes.
But body horror really makes me, like, squirm. There is something about particularly David Cronenberg's films and his early films that are so gross sometimes I have to, like, turn away. And, like, moments in The Fly, things like fingernails coming off, you know, like that kind of thing, teeth coming out, you know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm able to see this, but I absolutely shaking my head. I don't like that. Keep it.
Yeah, and you're right. You know, he's always been interested in the mind, but his career seems to have kind of slowly transitioned into being more about the mind than the body, I suppose, hasn't it? And Dead Ringers kind of feels like that sort of almost midway point, I think. Like, you know, just after The Fly and all of his 80s horror films, and then just before we get into that kind of that newer era of Cronenberg where he's more interested in kind of human behavior, I suppose.
Yeah. So, and I think, like, you know, the films that follow this are like Crash and then, you know, he moves on to, with like Eastern Promises, A History of Violence, with A Dangerous Method, where he just is directly talking about Freud, and it's just like, I'm tired of being coy about this, and just really, you know, sort of directly tackles the things that have informed his films since he started. But yeah, no, he's a fascinating director, and you know, again, he has very. I don't like to dictate or decide how a director feels personally based on his films, but he definitely has a trend of, you know, being really grossed out by women, specifically women's reproductive organs.
Yeah, there's that's so true, isn't there? There's clearly like an absolute fascination with all elements of the human body, but also a kind of, there must be in some way a kind of fear of them or a disgust of them as well, because look at how his films portray the human body, you know? It's like, it's not nice.
Yeah, and I think, the Dead Ringers specifically has a lot of parallels with something like Frankenstein. But he has there's something about, the maternal or the act of creation, and specifically like male creation, that, it comes out of a literary tradition that already sort of makes men, when men try to assume the role of the mother, it already turns them grotesque. And I mean, that's just to do with sort of established gender norms and the way that horror has always sort of recoiled at like anything that sort of, merges different boundaries. For Cronenberg, he's definitely like from in a really gendered way, thinking about acts of creation, and it's really fascinating to see where that takes him in different films. I guess I'm sort of cheating a little bit because I had asked to talk about The Brood, which is like I love that film, and I only watched it recently. But The Brood is something that spoiler alert, somebody skip ahead to like 2 minutes. She literally has like a womb on the outside of her body that begins to like reproduce these little, these monstrous children. And it's like, it from, I guess, like a Freudian perspective, it's like, all of his films are sort of quintessentially Freudian in that way. Like, they're very fantastically realized creation horrors. And so, yes, that's really interesting.
That moment with the reveal of the external womb is truly incredible and terrifying. I loved it so much.
It's haunting. It's haunting. I will never. It's an indelible image.
It really is. It's an image that sticks with you. Yeah. Amazing. Well, let's get into Dead Ringers then.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Beverly Mantle.
By every scientific measure, they are absolutely the same. They share everything.
You haven't had any experience until I've had it too. Bev, you've got to try the movie star. She's unbelievable.
Oh, doctor, you've cured me. You mean to say there's two of them? They're twins, dear.
I think we should drop her, Bev. You drop her. I'm in love with her. Can't be love if it does this to you, can it?
Doctor, I think there's something wrong with you.
Patients are getting strange. What are they? For working on mutant women.
From David Cronenberg, who in The Fly made the fantastic real.
Get him out of here! Radical technology was required. Something radical is definitely required.
Now, David Cronenberg makes reality the ultimate fantasy. Dead Ringers.
Separation can be a terrifying thing.
Okay, so Dead Ringers tells the story of the Mantle twins. And it is loosely based on real life twins who died in a apparent suicide pact, a double suicide. But basically it's about Elliot and Beverly Mantle. They are gynecologists, and they sort of operate as two or one half of a whole being. So Elliot is the more confident and public facing entity, and Beverly is the one who is just more fascinated by the sort of experimenting side of it. So he is, not just, I think they're both meant to be very smart and, very clinical, but Beverly is much more interested in praxis. And he is very, at a certain point, he meets and falls in love with this actress, Claire Nouveau, played by Geneviève Bujold. I hope I'm not mispronouncing her name too much. And she sort of brings a really destabilizing element. I think somebody said this at one point, that she's a disruptive element in the Mantle twin saga. And from then, Beverly sort of spirals out of control into this, because he's in love with Claire, but also you get the sense that she really distinguishes between the two twins, and this causes both of them to self-destruct and destroy each other.
Absolutely, yes. So first of all, I mean, you touched upon this already. You've got a lot of love for Jeremy Irons.
Yeah.
Tell me about your feelings just towards this film. What do you think of it? Are you a fan of Dead Ringers?
I like Dead Ringers a lot. Dead Ringers is very nostalgic for me. And I think that Jeremy Irons his performance, or I guess performances in this film are some of his best work. Also, I think it's, Jeremy Irons is also an actor who never phones it in. We love Anthony Hopkins, but Anthony Hopkins sometimes shows up for a check, and that's fine. Yeah. Jeremy Irons is always committing. It doesn't matter what the material is. And you certainly get the sense from this particular film, and also he would work with David Cronenberg again in this film called M. Butterfly, which is based on the opera, which is just not as good. I don't recommend anyone see it, although it does have John Lone in it, who is great. But, his performance in this film is really, it's so rich. It's so what's the word that I'm looking for? He clearly really relishes the material that he's given, and getting, a chance to be both showy and nuanced and subtle. And it's definitely some of my favorite Jeremy Irons performances is more than one. And it's, he was, I think also, I always end up doing this, and I hate that I do this, but it's, part of the way that I also entered into film was thinking about the Oscars. He would win an Oscar literally, I think, a year later for his performance in this film called Reversal of Fortune, which I also don't recommend, because that has that's a film that's been very sponsored by Alan Dershowitz. And but his performance in that is great, but he really, he lost the Oscar for Dead Ringers, and I think Jeremy Irons believed always that he got an Oscar for this film, as opposed to Reversal of Fortune. But it's just good. I mean, I will get into this later, how much of it is horror, and, whether or not it's, what people will get out of it when they come to it. But it's just great to watch him act.
Yeah, it really is. He's mesmerizing, isn't he? He's absolutely brilliant in this. Yeah, it's interesting that about whether or not this film is horror. I was even debating whether or not to, should I cover this film on this horror podcast? It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, what do you think about that? Would you class this film in any way as a horror film?
Yeah, I guess it sort of seems more it's more like a psychological thriller.
Yeah.
But and also I think I say problem in air quotes, but the horror moments are sparse. So it's really, I think, graphic stuff, and probably some of the scarier things in this film are things that you don't see. So there's a scene where Beverly, in the middle of a sort of mania, has created these instruments. And
just
to look at the instruments and know that these guys are gynecologists is, to me, chilling enough. I'm satisfied. Also, there's a scene in which he almost kills a patient when he's doing surgery on her. And there's also a fascinating scene. I mean, when we talk about Claire, this will be really interesting to revisit. But he has a nightmare where he's sort of conjoined by what seems like maybe an umbilical cord, but could be like a weird appendage thing. But he and Elliot are conjoined, and Claire has to bite it like in order to separate them.
And also it's very sexual because she's kind of licking it and biting it at the same time. Yeah, that's in some ways that dream sequence is the most classic Cronenbergian element of the film in some ways, in terms of the Cronenberg that we know up until this point. You know, it's like, there he is, a weird umbilical cord sex thing. You know, yeah, it is. Yeah, it's really interesting. I haven't made up my mind. I think you're right. A psychological thriller is probably spot on. There is definitely something very uneasy about it, I think, all the way through. And yeah, you know, there is still that kind of horrible, there's that horrible kind of painful body element processed, you know, in it. But I guess it just doesn't show you as much, which is quite a nice thing. And actually sometimes can be even more frightening, can't it? I think, you know, particularly like you say, when he uses those weird instruments on his patients, and we don't necessarily have to see it to know that that's not nice.
Yeah, and you know the fallout from that is that he's almost killed this woman, and they get fired from their positions at the clinic. And then you sort of get into his head a lot, which I also think is quite frightening. I mean, you know, again, those things are really psychological, but it's like you say, it's like really unsettling to watch somebody, you know, sort of barrel towards destruction, because you sort of know that it can only end in a really awful way. And then he has access to these violent weapons. And so it's, I personally, I think that people, you know, it does absolutely depend on what you want from a body horror, but definitely for those who are on the fence, who are like not quite at the Fly level.
Yeah.
A great entry.
Yeah, I think you're right. Some of the stuff we've talked about so far with Cronenberg is that some of his films can be a bit cold and clinical, I think. You know, when you look at The Brood, for example, when we talked about The Brood, we were talking about how that main character, that main guy, I can't even remember what his name is now, but he's a bit of a nothingy kind of protagonist, you know? And the same in some ways with James Woods in Videodrome and, you know, Shivers and some of these other movies. Sometimes the ideas seem more important to Cronenberg than maybe the kind of emotional core of a story. And then on the flip side, we've been talking about David Lynch, who's almost the polar opposite to that, where it's all emotion and no logic, you know. But how do you find Dead Ringers? Because again, a little bit different. Do you find that it's a story that you're able to kind of emotionally invest in?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that also has to do with the fact that it's about twins. And so already there's sort of an emotional, there's something centrally emotional driving the film. And it's weird because it can also, I suppose, be read in a way as Beverly himself, sort of like he can just be a schizophrenic character. And because, you know, Elliot is really confident and suave, and you don't really see the stages of his breakdown beyond knowing that this is his brother. A lot of times we also hear about, you know, Elliot has called on the phone. And so those things sort of, I mean, if you're sort of like, versed in horror, you sort of feel like it is leading up to the revelation that Elliot doesn't actually exist, like Elliot's in his head.
Yes.
You know, they are twins, and that still grounds the film in this really emotional, this emotional cocoon, a cocoon that they are also sort of in the film portrayed as being in constantly. Like they live together, they share women. We didn't talk about all that, but you know, one of the things that is part of their relationship, and Beverly says it, and they both like allude to it several times in these really ambiguous statements throughout the film, where they're like, "Oh, we share everything," and like, you know, we don't. Yeah, they just basically Elliot will have sex with the woman and then give the woman to Beverly. And so in a weird way, also, they're sort of like recreating their birth as well, in which they like share women. And it's all really wrapped up in these very conflicting emotions where it's like, yeah, you feel really sad because it's clear that Elliot cares about his brother, and his brother's mania is sort of manifesting in like heart attacks and fainting and drug addiction. And I think that sort of emerges on a really on a literal level. You know, you feel for those characters, even though I think they are extremely anomalous.
Yeah, definitely. You're right. Yeah. What do you think of the distinction between these two characters then? You know, I think, like you say, we're introduced. Elliot is the confident one, the kind of front-facing, the public-facing one, but also a bit of a dick, right? And then Beverly, who seems to be the slightly more sensitive one, but obviously has also a lot of kind of emotional and mental problems as well. Yeah. You know, and then I think there are I don't know if this is just me, but there are times when I wasn't 100% sure who we were watching in certain scenes, and I'm sure that's partly deliberate, but do you kind of get a good sort of clear sense of character going on throughout this film?
Well, I think like yes and no, because I think in part Claire is there even like just symbolically as this mother figure, because she's sort of defined. I don't know if we mentioned this as well, but like the thing about Claire is that she has a triple cervix, which is not a real thing, and it's the thing that David Cronenberg made up. I guess the way that I sort of like, you know, reckon with it in my head was like, oh, she represents like 3, and so she's more powerful than somebody who embodies like a 2. And things like that. But, you know, she really begins to distinguish the twins. It's only sort of after she's like, and also there are some scenes where she says like, you're Elliot or whatever, that you realize like, oh, yes, because the other thing that they do is they switch places. They wear each other's clothes sometimes, or they pretend to each other. And you never know when that's happening. And I think that you're right. Like that's deliberate on the part of Cronenberg and also in Jeremy Irons' performance. As the scene goes on, you begin to realize who is who. But often in the beginning of a scene, you are very confused as to which one is which, because they, you know, clearly part of their huge problem is that they don't see each other as separate. They see each other as like, you know, as we said in the beginning, like one half of a whole person.
Yeah. And what's really fascinating about it, the more you learn about them, obviously, is that even though Elliot feels like this confident one, you know, this charismatic one, he's better with women, he's the kind of public-facing guy, he actually, I think, needs Beverly much more than Beverly needs him, right? He really relies on Beverly for his sort of confidence boosts, I think. Whereas Beverly, you get the feeling is, you know, he's not really benefiting from this relationship with his brother. He wants to go off and meet someone else. You know, he's really obsessed with Claire, whereas Elliot is kind of obsessed with Beverly. So there is that really interesting dynamic there.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, Beverly, his in his relationship with Claire, I mean, Beverly is such a needy lover. He is a very needy boyfriend. But also absolutely, I think a person that I would go for. I mean, he says at one point, like, oh, I think there should be beauty contests for the insides of a woman, like the most beautiful queen. Like, he's such a nerd.
Also, that feels like that comes straight from Cronenberg as well. Yeah, I genuinely think Cronenberg probably feels that way too.
I think that's very obvious from his filmography. But yeah, I think, you know, Beverly, in his relationship with Claire, the thing that really haunts him is that Elliot hates him, is because he has betrayed Elliot. It's not that, you know, he regrets falling in love with Claire. It's that he regrets letting his brother down. And then Elliot also tries to sort of proposition Claire. And I think he goes to her work, to her set, and he like says to her again, like while they're in her trailer, like, you know, Beverly and I have always shared everything, and sort of tries to get her to engage in like a threesome or, you know, some sort of polyamorous situation, but she declines because she wants Beverly. She's in love with Beverly. And I think that's really interesting as well, because she's clearly like, she destabilizes them because she not only distinguishes them, but she also expresses a preference. She doesn't see them as one at all. And yeah, I think that then becomes, for these two men who have, been so psychologically entangled, that is destructive.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll come back to Claire. Let me first of all ask you a bit about, the choice, I suppose, to make these characters gynecologists. I mean, this is an interesting, obviously very deliberate choice. And, you're right. The first thing we learn about Claire is that she's got 3 cervixes. That's like her thing. That's how she's introduced. How do you find, you alluded to this earlier, how do you find the way in which women, and particularly, I suppose, women's bodies and reproductive systems and everything else are kind of handled and portrayed in this film by Cronenberg?
I mean, if I'm being real, I try not to think about it too much, because I feel like I'm gonna not. It's just so, it's unsettling, because it sort of presents women's bodies as, to me, inherently grotesque and something that, must be experimented on or dissected. I mean, I think there's also a way to read this film as, these men have, much like Frankenstein, the doctors themselves are the monsters. And so they can only, what they're actually what they're actually experimenting on is something that they're actually envious of. And I suppose them being gynecologists, I've not phrased this in a particularly articulate way, but to go back to when they're kids, like the opening scene of the film, they are talking about sex as, this experiment of procreation. So one of them is like, and I can't really tell which one is which at this point at all. I think they say each other's names, but they're like, fish they don't need to have sex because they can have babies underwater, and humans have to have sex because they have to create the water, which is really weird. And I think also becomes like a through line into their adulthood, because sex is much less about pleasure and more about, experimentation, even when they are, seemingly enjoying sex. Like the sex scene with Beverly and Claire, he has her like tied up with these surgical things, whatever you ask surgeons. I don't know what they're called properly, but they're like those like little yellow surgeon hand things, and scissors are stuck in between the knots for some reason.
Yeah, some kinky stuff going on there.
Exactly. I mean, right, like, everyone live your life, but also very confusing. But yeah, so I think it's fascinating that they're gynecologists, because it's clear like they're even those moments where sex seems to be about pleasure, right? Even for Elliot is constantly preoccupied with his brother. So when he wants to hear about, what sex is like with Claire Neveu, even though he's already had sex with her. He invites Claire to have a threesome with them. There's also a scene in which Elliot's girlfriend is dancing with him, and Beverly is depressed because he's broken up with Claire because he thinks that she's cheating on him. She's not. And the three of them start dancing together, and it's Beverly who stops it because he's still, mourning Claire, and then he proceeds to like have a heart attack or a stroke or something. But yeah, it seems that even in those like pleasurable sexual situations, that actually Elliot only wants to share sex with his brother, which is also interesting because, literary doppelganger novels like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and also Frankenstein. I feel like I keep talking about that book a lot, but those films, those doubles especially also have really homoerotic implications, and they're also written like in the Victorian period where those things were very hushed up and also simultaneously very feared. And so yeah, it's interesting to like see those things still pop up in this film, which is like 1988, even though it's very much a film about, you know, what women's bodies do, it doesn't seem like actually having sex with women is all that interesting or portrayed as fun at all.
Yeah, you're so right. And there's got to be some sort of interesting reason for why they've given them, you know, they call each other Ellie and Bev, right? They've got female names as well, which is interesting. And there is that one moment, isn't there, when I think Beverly gets really defensive about it, and he's like, "I'm not gay," and stuff. There is that slight kind of weird sort of insecure masculinity there or something, isn't there, as well?
Yeah, it's a very weird scene because, you know, it's interesting that we're talking about like gynecology and sex, because they are able to, you know, they're helping women procreate without actually having sex with them as well, which is interesting.
Yeah. But
also, they never really talk about their mother. She's not like a real I mean, their father isn't in the film either. But it's the thing I think is notable is that actually, yeah, they do mention the mother at least twice. So Beverly has that scene where he gets really annoyed at Claire for not at all insinuating that he was gay, but he takes it that way. And then they, at the end, right before they die, they eat cake like children. They like really regress, and they're like stuffing their faces. And I think it's Beverly who says, "Mommy didn't get any cake," and it's really, there's something quite chilling about it. There's always chilling about a grown man saying "mommy." It's like that's something that jumped out to me.
Yeah, it's so true. A conversation we've just had actually about Dennis Hopper and Blue Velvet, but there is definitely something weird about a grown man saying mummy. Very disturbing. Yeah, it is interesting. Let me ask you a bit about the character of Claire then as well, because she is a really interesting character. And like you say, she's the kind of, in some ways, she's the story, isn't she? She's the one that sort of drives this drama between them throughout the film. What do you think of Claire sort of as a character in this story?
I suppose I should say that I love Geneviève Bujold, who is great in this. And not what you asked, but also, you know, I was looking up the cast list, and Kiefer Sutherland's mom is in this film as well. So
no way.
The first wife of Donald Sutherland, she's the woman, Laura, who tells her that they are twins at all, because Claire doesn't know at first that she's sleeping with both of the Mantle twins. She only thinks that she's sleeping with Beverly. But yeah, that's Shirley Douglas, I think her name is.
Wow.
But yeah, Claire is a, you know, she has a very serious role, but I think she's a bit of fun because she clearly is, you know, very over it. She has certainly some of the best lines, which are difficult to repeat because they're sort of like, they could be very graphic. She says to, when she first meets, in quotes, both of the Mantle twins at like a lunch, she says like, "So Beverly's the sweet one and you're the little shit." And she's so great. It's such a, like, I think it's a really, like, you know, I wonder what this film would have looked like in a different actress's hands. I don't know if anybody else, who else was considered, but she plays it really confidently. And, you know, she is a hard one to pin down because you would think like, this is a woman who is clearly like very experienced in a way that Beverly doesn't seem to be. And yet she continues to tolerate him and his neediness. But then you think like, oh, she's also a woman who wants to have a kid. And part of the reason that she even goes to the Mantle twins to begin with is that she wants to know what's, you know, quote unquote, wrong with her body.
There is also that kind of almost slight sort of satire of Hollywood creeping in, isn't there, as well? I mean, this is something that we've seen in Maps to the Stars recently with Cronenberg, but that kind of, she's an actress, isn't she? And whenever we kind of disappear into the world of her job and the people she works with, it suddenly becomes almost, that side of it is quite monstrous as well, I think, you know, in some ways. There is definitely that element of satire there, I think, isn't there? Yeah,
and there's always a kind of, you know, I'm saying that she's very controlled, but there is some sort of like implicit duplicity there. At least Elliot keeps saying like she's an actress, so you can't believe anything that she says. There is an incredible scene that is brilliantly acted by Jeremy Irons. And it's so hilarious because it's like after Beverly thinks that Claire has been cheating on him, and he's like crying, and he's telling his brother Elliot is just like, what's wrong with you? Like, what happened? And he says, Claire's cheating on me. And the way that he rolls his eyes, like, I'm like his feeling is that, you know, she is a cheat, that she is essentially a fraud because she's an actress, and that everything is a performance. And so for him, for Elliot, I mean, she doesn't really read as somebody who is human. Not that they care about anybody except each other anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's that element, the fact that she's an actress, is very interesting.
It is. And especially considering, you know, Elliot, yeah, he talks about that from the beginning, doesn't he? That, you know, and considering he's such a performative character too, and the whole point is they play each other and all of these other things, you know, it's really interesting. What do you think of the sort of the final act then, and the way that Jeremy Irons handles it, and also the way that the film handles it, that their sort of joint sort of descent, I suppose, into depression, into this breakdown, whatever it is, before they eventually end up, you know, dead at the end. How did you find that sort of final act of the film?
I think it's brilliant. It's really, there's some of it is quite disorienting. I think purposefully, of course, because they are at this point like fully regressed and sort of in a cocoon of drugs and not at all, you know, in any sort of way lucid. And there's like, you know, fragmented sentences that they say to each other. The fact that they're talking about, you know, mommy, and they're eating cake and stuff. And then you see, I mean, you know what's happening, you know, when Beverly begins to operate on Elliot. And then, you know, not you, but, you know, the scene cuts to the next morning when he wakes up. And I think that is like probably one of the most really, like, I feel like I've used this word a lot, but it is quite chilling, right? Because the way that it is arranged is that Elliot is on a surgical bed with, you know, his chest fully open and bloody, because Beverly has operated on him in this drug state. And Beverly doesn't seem to see him. He wakes up and he is just saying, Ellie, where are you? And he looks in that direction, but it seems as if he hasn't actually seen his brother. And I think it's, you know, there are multiple ways to obviously read that sequence, but in particular, it's very, you know, well acted by Jeremy Irons. And then I think, you know, right after that, he gets up and he gets dressed in Elliot's clothes and he goes to call Claire, who says, you know, who is this? And he never answers. And it, you know, obviously this film has made that question so loaded. And he returns to sort of die in his brother's arms in this way that, you know, the film has this opening credit sequence that is animated, and there's like a pair of babies that are sort of leaning or draped across each other in this way, which I love that stuff. I love when
so good.
Let's throw back to some sort of animation or pose or and it's interesting because I'd actually like talked about Carrie with someone recently, with Anna Bogutskaya actually. That to me that's another film that is very, you know, Freudian and deeply you know, very steeped in these like psychoanalysis ideas, and they both end with, you know, these two relatives, these two kin, a mother and a daughter, and then twins, sort of draped and dying together.
Totally. Yeah, you're so right. And also there's a weird like, same with Carrie, when Carrie's mother is killed, there's an almost like tableau-esque kind of look to it. Yeah. And the same with the look of their bodies at the end, almost like it's some sort of art sculpture or something. That's what I always think of. And again, there is definitely something in this, isn't there, to do with art and science and the kind of distinction between the two. I think obviously you have the artist who designed those surgical tools, so it's very much kind of in the forefront of the story here, and there is a lot of references to, you know, as we've mentioned, the world of acting versus the world of medicine, and the kind of performative aspect of being a doctor. And, you know, I guess this is something that Cronenberg has always dealt with. He is an artist. He is creating pieces of art that are very much focused on science. So there is definitely something there, isn't there? There's a kind of fascination between the two. So finally then, you know, how do you think this film holds up 30 years later? Would you still recommend it to people?
I think it does hold up. It's definitely really sleek. I think it's one of his stronger films, and he has many strong films. Like, he's obviously not a bad filmmaker. And there are people who are sort of undecided on his films of late, his latest films. But I think this one is sort of, you know, it's very well executed. It can, I think, read as misogynistic, but I still think that, you know, there's something valuable within it. And I think it's a really complex film as well. And so just rewatching it even recently, like even just, you know, the other night, I found so many new things in it that I hadn't seen before. And I'd only watched it before, like maybe a year or so ago. So I'd watched it of late. So it's just, to me, like a very rich, very dense film that has really, even if they're, you know, I don't think this is a film that's sort of inviting you to, you know, engage in some sort of philosophy or anything like that. But I think it is super entertaining and very well executed. Like, I still like that. It looks great as well.
And Jeremy Irons is just so damn good and so likable too. I think, you know, that's maybe too likable. I don't know, but you know, I just love him in this. And I think this is, for me, you know, like for me, The Fly and this are kind of peak Cronenberg, and that's because they do have that more emotional core, you know, like we've talked about The Fly, which is essentially like a love story, a really gross love story, but it is a love story, and it's really beautiful in that regard. And I think it's the same with this, like unlike some of his earlier work that was maybe a bit more cold and clinical, this film has like Jeremy Irons at the heart of it, gives it that kind of emotional heft, I think, probably as well. Yeah,
I agree. And irrelevant, but also, you know, his outfits as Elliot are very 80s. I mean, like, there's that huge velvet coat that he has, and he has like a little thin purple scarf. It's just great 80s fashion.
Yeah, it's so good. And obviously there's that really iconic kind of costume that they wear in surgery as well. Those red, they almost look like they're part of a cult or something, don't they? Those robes, they almost look religious or something.
Right. It's just, and it's very strange because it's just like, all of these people cloaked in red operating on a woman's body, which is just like not great iconography. I don't want it. But yeah, and it's strange because, you know, you don't see, it's just a very odd surgical outfit. I have no idea if this is the way that Canadians practice medicine, but like, you know, you don't see anything except their eyes. Like, it is a kind of full body wear that, you know, just covers every inch of them. And so it looks like, it gives the impression of very much like a cult. You're right.
It really does. Yeah, I love it. It makes it so striking. I think that's the thing. And again, there's just that little bit more like almost surrealism, I think, to some of those operational scenes that Cronenberg hasn't had so much before. So yeah, I love all that about it. Amazing. Kelli, thank you so much for this, and thank you so much for joining me. Final couple of questions for you, which I ask all my new guests.
Yeah.
First of all, what's your favorite horror film?
This is such a hard question. I really thought about this. I think I want it to be like really sophisticated and have like some old, really obscure film. But actually, if I'm being real, like my favorite horror films are pretty recent. I love Christine.
Oh yeah,
it's really good. It's a Stephen King adaptation by John Carpenter. And I love The Others, which you did an episode of, and it's great. Like The Others is a film. The Others is probably the film that returned me to horror after I watched one Pedro Almodovar film and was like, I am a sophisticated cinephile when I was like 13. But I really love The Others. So yeah, I think they're my favorite.
It's just beautiful. The Others is just a masterpiece, isn't it? Amazing. Well, Kelli, thank you so much for this. If people want to come and find you and find more of your work and more of your writing and that kind of thing, where can they find you out there on the internet?
I suppose you can find me on Twitter. It's Kelli Weston It'll be spelled down, but Kelli Weston. So you can find me on Twitter. I also write for Movie Notebook. I think I named some of them already, but like Film Comment, Sight and Sound. So you can find me in like all the usual places like that.
Amazing. Kelli, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
To me, it's too important to not watch. It's, if not one of the most famous horror films. And it shouldn't be, because it's some random, low-key, pokey, exploitation movie that was shot out in Colombia because cannibal movies were making bank at the time.
Cannibal Holocaust is an outstanding piece of cinema. It's it maybe is the first found footage film, and it does challenge you. It's a very challenging film, and so is Salò. And I think sometimes as horror fans, we should challenge ourselves.
Hello everybody, that was a little clip you heard just there from my discussion with Brad Hanson and Zobo with a Shotgun. That was part 2 of our Extreme mini-series, which is playing over on Patreon right now. That is an exclusive mini-season just for $10 patrons, in which Brad, Zobo and I are going to be spending 6, possibly 7 weeks discussing some of the most depraved and disturbing movies ever made. This week we began our series of deep dive discussions and started with 2 Italian classics. That's Salò from 1975 and Cannibal Holocaust from 1980. This mini-series is not for the faint-hearted, but if you think you can handle it, you can sign up now over on Patreon. Head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. $10 donors will get access to that mini-series as well as a whole Twin Peaks mini-series, which is running alongside it. But if you want to donate $5 per month, you'll also get access to other bonus episodes that come once every 2 weeks, and that can include festival coverage, new releases, and mailbag episodes. Anybody who signs up to Patreon that's UK-based will also get sent an Evolution of Horror sticker, and you all get a very special shout-out on the main podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the last couple of weeks a very special thank you. So a big thanks to Luke Van Boom, Katie Bradford, John Stewart, Stephanie Mears, John Dangerfield, Eric Winnick, Hope Zelly, Lucy Roche, Ellen Neeling, Anna St. Auburn, Tomb Juice, Hannah Stevenson, Chloe Vigoro, Brooks Kenny, Justine Green, Bruce Easton, and Catherine Mazer. A huge thank you to all of those people. And one more time, if you want to get involved, sign up to our Patreon and be treated to regular bonus content, then you can. Head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. That's patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. Okay, now we're moving into the second half of this week's episode, in which we are going to be discussing Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me. I will one more time emphasise spoiler alert, of course, for Fire Walk With Me, but also spoiler alert for seasons 1 and 2 of Twin Peaks. We will be giving away major plot details of the first 2 seasons of Twin Peaks. Okay, here is my chat with the brilliant Anna Bogutskaya. Anna, welcome back. Hello.
Hi, Mike. It's good to be back. It's only been
a couple of weeks.
I don't know time anymore.
No, time means nothing anymore, does it? No. How's life for you? I mean, we were just talking before we started recording. You recently made your Wittertainment debut, filling in for Mark Kermode. How was that?
That was really exciting.
So cool.
That was really fun. It was quite overwhelming because I got a lot of really, really lovely, genuinely really lovely messages, and a couple couple of really hateful ones, which are fun.
Of course. Yeah. Goes without saying.
Yeah, but yeah, it means a lot, and it was really fun. I hope I get to do it again because it was exciting.
Yes. So last time you were here, we were talking about Possession. Now we're going to be talking about all things David Lynch. Let me ask you. We've covered a couple of films already so far this series. We talked about Eraserhead, and we've just done Blue Velvet as well. Let me ask you before we get into all things Twin Peaks. Are you a Lynch fan? What do you think of his work, broadly speaking?
I mean, there's only one correct answer to that question.
There is.
It's obviously I am. And obviously, even if I wasn't, I know how much of a fan you are, so I would always say yes. But no, I genuinely am.
We talked about Twin Peaks together over on Patreon, but just for people who haven't heard that, tell me a little bit of, just as a bit of background context, what's your own relationship with the TV show Twin Peaks? Are you a fan?
100% a fan. And also, it was probably the show that made me realize what television was and really start considering television on the same creative level as film. Because I think with anyone who, I studied film, and it was one of the kind of courses that I took when I was studying film studies in Paris was actually about TV. And basically we spent a few months analyzing Twin Peaks, like literally maybe a couple of weeks analyzing just the introduction montage. Like incredible. But also it was that moment when I started reading a lot more, and Twin Peaks was fundamentally one of the shows that changed people's and audiences and executives' perceptions of what television could be, and it made television into a visual art form, which it is. And when we're seeing the legacy of that now in the whatever platinum age of television, because it's no longer the golden age, or like we're beyond, you can trace everything back almost to Twin Peaks, especially season 1, which ran from 1990 to 1991, I think. So yeah, I'm a massive fan.
Yeah, and to quote you actually on Patreon, you said it's pretty much one of the most perfect seasons of television you can get, right? Series 1 of Twin Peaks.
Thank you for reminding me of the stuff that I said, because I literally have no memory of anything that I say in your podcast, Mike.
Yeah, that's okay. It's all a blur. I know what you mean. But I just loved that because I think you're right. And it's interesting, like you said, it kind of changed television. And there are so many TV shows now these days, whether it's Riverdale or whatever it might be, that people will describe as in some way Twin Peaks-esque or Lynchian. A lot of people use that word Lynchian. What do you think they mean by that? How would you describe kind of a Lynchian in its style?
When I think of something Lynchian, I'm thinking of darkness underneath the glossiness. Lynch is really fascinated, particularly with Americana, with American culture, with sort of the classic white picket fence, everything being proper, and kind of all of these signifiers and small icons of American culture, everything from cherry pie to the white picket fence to kind of the suburban houses to the way that people dress to the way that people speak. But then there's always layers of darkness underneath, and those layers of darkness kind of poking through the glossy exterior is what I think of when I think of Lynchian stuff. It's kind of the glossiness, but actually it's barely covering up the darkness and the gross and the potentially deadly elements that exist underneath all of that.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with you. I think is that there's that duality. There's that what you think something is on the surface, and then what it really is underneath. And that is often the story of Lynch. Like you say, that's Twin Peaks, that's Blue Velvet. But also it kind of even, you could go one step further with it and talk about the film itself, the genre even. You might think you're watching a crime thriller or a film noir like Mulholland Drive, until it actually reveals itself to be a kind of tragic love story in the case of Mulholland Drive. Or you think you're watching, a kind of crime investigation procedural with Twin Peaks. Or you think you're watching a soap opera, but then actually it reveals itself somewhere along the way to be something else entirely. So I think it's always that. It's that kind of, his films are kind of two things in one almost. Like there's one story hidden beneath another story or something like that. That's how I always think of it.
17 things in one.
Yes, exactly that. And then, so again, before we get into the film, just to give a bit of background context, Twin Peaks ran for 2 seasons, and then it kind of just, well, in series 2, and we've talked about this over on Patreon, but series 2 really kind of hit a kind of a low when the mystery of who killed Laura Palmer was solved. The show eventually sort of declined in its ratings, and then it just sort of petered out, really, didn't it? By this point that Fire Walk with Me came out, had people just kind of had enough of Twin Peaks, do you think? I mean, the show had ended, right?
Well, it's interesting because the show had ended, but also the story of Twin Peaks, both creatively and in terms of its success with audiences, I find really interesting because season 1 just like grabbed everyone.
Yeah.
Everybody was obsessed. The central mystery is so simple and it's so beautiful in its simplicity. It's like, who killed Laura Palmer? You know, dead blonde girl. That's how all, you know, interesting American thrillers start, right?
Yes.
It's with a dead girl. Yeah. But she was such a kind of image of American perfection, American teenage girl perfection, that really kept the interest going. And then when her murderer was revealed, sort of mid-season 2, and then it became very esoteric, very concerned with multiple realities, with the spirit world. It became very complicated, and actually the mystery kind of went off the side of it, and I think that really alienated audiences. It wasn't as successful. People were kind of fed up. They wanted the good shit that they had experienced with season 1. And also I've been reading that a lot of the makers, the actual actors, also felt a little bit alienated by the way that the season petered out, basically, which is why, and we'll come to this when we talk about the actual film, some of them are not involved in Fire Walk with Me because they were a bit like, dude, you kind of ditched us and abandoned us with the second season, so why are we going to continue going back to this world? Because is it just going to be more of the lodge and the weird red room and people talking backwards? Because that's not what I'm interested in.
Yeah, you're so right. And I think there is that weird tension with Twin Peaks that it feels like lots of people thought Twin Peaks were different things. You know, I think David Lynch very much has in his head what Twin Peaks is really about. And I think we see that maybe in Fire Walk with Me. And maybe Mark Frost had another idea of what he thought Twin Peaks was. And maybe the network had their own idea. And I think that you see that start to kind of fall apart in the second series. And, you know, reportedly David Lynch kind of gave up on being involved in the show in the latter half of the second season, right? He went off and did other stuff, and you can feel that purity of how it begins had kind of disappeared, I suppose, right? Like you said, that simple story of that blonde girl, that dead blonde girl had gone, hadn't it, I suppose?
You're so right. It's almost the pressures of success. And I think an interesting way to compare it to is True Detective Season 2.
Yes.
So True Detective Season 1, I think, is also one of the most amazing single seasons of television. Beautiful piece of work, very, very authored by one guy's kind of story and his imagination. But then it was so successful that the pressure of following up on that promise and on the pressures of audiences, executives. In the case of Twin Peaks, obviously, you know, also the tensions between Mark Frost and David Lynch also played a part in that. All of that then suddenly became, it's not a thing that they needed to prove could work or had value, artistic and potentially audience-wise. Now the expectations were so high that they had to answer to them, but also creatively. That doesn't necessarily mean that's where their head was at. And you can really tell that season 2 is kind of going in directions that maybe the network really wants them to do this, and then perhaps the performers wanted them to do something else, and they individually as artists, as creatives, wanted to do something different. And also the medium, you know, Lynch wanted to make movies. Mark Frost also wanted to make films, and he did go off and make films, but it's also that thing of like, are we using this as a springboard, or are we going to get stuck in Twin Peaks for the rest of our careers?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think all of these things were going on. You know, David Lynch interested in other projects. He had also had his kind of creative control taken away. All of these elements came into play. The show's ratings just went down and down and down until eventually, which we've already discussed, Season 2 ended up being the last season of Twin Peaks before it was cancelled. And not only was it sad for a lot of fans that this show ended, but also that it ended on such a cliffhanger. I mean, we talked about that incredible final episode already where Dale Cooper is stuck in the lodge. And just to think that that was how the program ended and there would be no resolution to that was, you know, so frustrating, I think, for so many fans around the world. So this happened, the show was cancelled, and then all of a sudden, 1 year later, 1992, a new Twin Peaks film arrives and premieres at Cannes. And it's been made by David Lynch, but not Mark Frost. So this is kind of a pure David Lynch vision of Twin Peaks that we're seeing here for the first time. And of all things, this isn't a sequel that continues on after that cliffhanger. This is a prequel. This is David Lynch going back to what he loved most about the original series and the original pilot, which is that story surrounding that blonde girl, Laura Palmer. So, there's lots to cover, Anna. Let's get into it. Let's begin our discussion of Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me.
So essentially, this film functions as both a prequel and a sequel to Twin Peaks, the series. And it's sort of mainly the biggest chunk of the film shows us Laura Palmer's life just before she is murdered. So essentially, we go back to the town of Twin Peaks. We are not as involved with the rest of the characters in the town. Dale Cooper does not play such a big role in this film. It's all about Laura and her inner turmoil and her journey and sort of the period of time just before her murder leading up to it. Mm-hmm. And it essentially solves the mystery and the mystery of the death of Laura Palmer. But fundamentally, and I was thinking because I rewatched the first season for your Patreon series on Twin Peaks, and when I was rewatching this, I was thinking, whilst Twin Peaks the season is trying to answer the question of who killed Laura Palmer, I think the easiest way to summarize Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me is that it's trying to answer the question of who is Laura Palmer.
Yes, that's so right, isn't it? That is exactly it. We're spending all of this time with this character who in the series was just this kind of ghost almost lingering over everything, who we didn't really know much about other than uncovering clues about. This film, I think, very deliberately starts with an image of a television. We're seeing TV static during the opening credits. And then the first image we see is a TV being smashed to pieces with a baseball bat. Which I think is a very non-subtle way, perhaps, of saying this is not going to be the Twin Peaks TV show that you know and love. This is going to be something entirely different. And we'll get to what various different people's reactions were to this film later. But first of all, let me just ask you, Anna, what do you think of this film? How did it meet your expectations? Are you a fan?
I am. I was a fan of this film before. And actually, this is the third or fourth time that I've seen it. And it's one of those films that sort of shifts slightly every time I've seen it. So I remember the first time I watched it was on the back of finishing Twin Peaks, the series, for the first time, when about, 10 years ago or something.
Yeah.
And then I didn't really like it at all on first watch.
Interesting.
And then I rewatched it a few years ago, and I completely 180'd my opinion. Mm-hmm. I saw, because I think when I saw it for the first time, and I think maybe this also is part of why it's so Marmite with Twin Peaks fans, is that you expect it to solve a lot of unanswered questions.
Yes.
You expect it to be a movie version of the show.
Yes.
It isn't. It's its own standalone horror film. So when the first time I saw it, I was kind of removed from the series enough that I saw it in its own right, and it is fundamentally an incredible horror film. And it is a horror film about a teenage girl's inner pain and turmoil. And it ends horrifically, but it is so interesting because it kind of twists the very basic premise of Twin Peaks, in the sense that it doesn't start with a dead girl's body kind of as, an object. It's all about her in her life and the horror and the pain that she's going through and that she's put through, and it doesn't objectify her in the same way as the series does. So I thought it was incredibly arresting. There's bits of it that I still, look at and I was like, I don't, what? But the majority of it, like about 85% of the film, I was like, this is an absolute masterpiece. I love it.
Yeah, me too. I agree. I love it so much. And I think you're right. I think it all depends on what your expectations are from this film. If you're expecting it to be Twin Peaks and return to those characters, that coffee, that cherry pie, to characters like Audrey and Dale Cooper, you're going to be bitterly disappointed, aren't you? That's
Totally.
the thing. But for people like us that probably quite enjoy this kind of bleak, nihilistic horror film about pain and torment, and genuinely, in my opinion, frightening kind of horror film, I think it's, like you say, a masterpiece in what it does there. I think it's absolutely incredible. You just have to kind of separate it a little bit in your head, don't you, from Twin Peaks, and be like, okay, this is going to be something entirely different, you know?
Totally.
But interestingly, of course, this film was really not well received. So it premiered at Cannes and people booed, people laughed at it, people heckled it, people walked out. And this was only a couple of years after Lynch had just won the Palme d'Or with Wild at Heart. So this, you know, this wasn't some unknown hack director. This was a very well-respected auteur bringing his new film to Cannes Film Festival, and it was so badly received. Why do you think that is, Anna? Why did people not take to this movie?
I mean, it's hard to speculate, but I imagine it is because of that. It's because of the pressure of the brand of Twin Peaks, essentially. And it's a little bit callous to refer to it as a brand, but that's the recognizable thing. And, you know, when the film is called Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, it's not called Fire Walk with Me.
Yeah.
It's not... It is and it isn't a standalone David Lynch film.
Yeah.
Because it's weighted down by the success and also the disappointing ending of Twin Peaks. There's so many expectations placed on it to both be an incredible David Lynch film and, you know, a modern American auteur. A solution to a lot of the issues that plague Twin Peaks, especially season 2.
Yeah.
And also... an extension of the show that people loved for a very long time and then kind of were disappointed by and finished abruptly. So how is it supposed to solve all of those things? It's impossible.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I was thinking about it because I thought, yeah, you know, in some ways this film... We talked about it a little bit with Possession, where we said, you know, there might be genre fans who are frustrated that you don't see the fuck monster until, you know, the second half of the film. And there might be kind of art house fans that don't like how schlocky and grindhousey it is. And I think there might be an element of that with this film too, where Twin Peaks fans might be really disappointed because it's not, you know, wrapping up any mysteries for them. But then also non-Twin Peaks fans must watch this film and be like, what the fuck is going on? You know, because also I was thinking, could you watch this film having not seen Twin Peaks with no prior knowledge of Twin Peaks? I'm not sure if you could. What do you think?
I'm going to say yes. And I think actually I would argue that it's better to watch it without any Twin Peaks knowledge.
Right. Okay.
I think it works on several levels. But also, as you were talking, I was thinking, what do we call Twin Peaks fans? Do we call ourselves Twinkies? What do we call ourselves?
Peaks.
There's Trekkies.
Peakies.
Peakies.
I've got a feeling it is Peakies. Yeah, I think it is.
I'm partial to Twinkies, but okay.
I like Twinkies as well. That's good.
Let's go with Peakies. Going back to my earlier point, I actually think that if you don't know Twin Peaks, but say you like David Lynch stuff, this is a really interesting film to watch by itself, because essentially it's the self-contained story of Laura Palmer. So I think it works as a standalone thing.
Yeah.
It works on another level if you're a Twin Peaks fan.
Yes.
Because then you recognize characters, you recognize things that will happen, and you have an entirely different experience of the film because you know that she's going to end up murdered. You know that going in, as opposed to someone who doesn't, because then you're sort of living her life, and then the crescendo is that she gets murdered by her own abusive father. Yeah. But if you know that that's going to happen already, then everything has this added layer of abuse and sadness and the expectation of the horrific.
Yeah, it's that Lynchian dread, I suppose, isn't it? That's really there because we know her fate. Yeah. So, like you said, there is so much to this film. There's so much crammed in. There's even like an hour and a half worth of extra footage that didn't go into this film that people can now actually watch as well, isn't there? But there was clearly, and it's doing a million jobs, this film, I think. It's telling this story. It's also kind of dipping into Twin Peaks mythology, and it's got so much to do. So That is interesting in itself. Let me ask you, first of all, about the first 30 minutes of this film, where we're not in Twin Peaks, right? We are suddenly introduced to these characters we've never seen before. Agent Chet Desmond, played by Chris Isaac, and Sam Stanley, played by Kiefer Sutherland, investigating the murder of a woman called Teresa Banks. What did you think of that whole initial setup?
I genuinely, I've seen this film 4 times. I still don't fucking know.
No.
I'm like, what is Chris Isaac doing here? What is David Bowie doing there? I'm just like,
I know.
What is happening?
Jet, give Sam Stanley the glad hand. He's come over from Spokane.
It's a pleasure. I've heard a lot about you.
Sam's the man who cracked the Whitman case.
Congratulations. I heard about that.
Chet, your surprise. Her name is Lil. She's my mother's sister's girl.
Federal.
I think weirdly this is the part that is off-putting for non-Twin Peaks fans.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're not familiar with Dale, if you're not familiar with Gordon, if you're not familiar with kind of that esoteric flavor that at least a little bit in season 1 and definitely a lot more in season 2 was emphasized, it really puts you off because it's quite funny and there seems to be an inkling of a mystery to be solved, but we're not really getting much time with any of the characters. We're not really getting much personality from either of them. They're sort of cookie by numbers, and it's kind of a very strange, almost prologue that frankly you can totally skip.
Yes. Yeah, I did, especially the first couple of times I watched this. I found myself wanting to, because I've seen it probably about 4 times now as well, and the first couple of times I was always very much like, ugh, this section. Yeah, you just got to get through it and wait for them to return to Twin Peaks. I think this time around I kind of appreciated it a little bit more maybe, and I wonder if it kind of links into the stuff we were saying before about that kind of duality of stories that Lynch introduces. Because I think, what you think, if you had no prior knowledge, I suppose, and you come into that first act of this film, you think you're watching a kind of forensic serial killer investigation film, really. It's like a body has washed up in a bag wrapped in plastic. You've got introduced to these 2 FBI agents, and they have to solve clues and crack a case. And I guess what this begins as is a similar sort of genre to what Twin Peaks begins as, which is this procedural mystery, There's that really interesting scene at the beginning of Fire Walk With Me where we see the woman, Lil, I think, with the red dress and the blue rose and the colourful hair and all of the different clues, visual clues that this woman is projecting. And it's almost like at the beginning of the film, David Lynch is saying, right, from the top here, this is the sort of thing you have to look for. It's like David Lynch is setting up his own visual language or something, and he's kind of giving us the key here at the beginning and kind of letting us know, like, we have to find clues in everything we see.
What exactly did that mean?
I'll explain it to you. Remember, Lil's wearing a sour face.
What do you mean?
Her face had a sour look on it. We're gonna have problems with the local authorities. I'm not gonna be receptive to the FBI. Both eyes blinking means trouble higher up. The eye is the local authority. Sheriff and a deputy be my guess. You notice she had one hand in her pocket, which means they're hiding something. And the other hand made into a fist, which means they're going to be belligerent.
So we get that kind of strange setup. David Lynch is kind of plopping us in this world, and he's telling us that it's important to look for clues, and we're trying to kind of solve a puzzle. Then we jump to a whole bunch of new characters in Philadelphia for this really weird kind of 10-minute segment in which we meet Special Agent Dale Cooper, played by Carl McLaughlin, who of course fans of the TV show will know, and there is this bizarre moment in which we have David Bowie burst into the room and sort of give these cryptic messages about a place that he's been to and these people that he's met. And then we get this flash of all of these strange-looking characters sat in a room above a convenience store. They're kind of speaking in that sort of strange, backwards, reversed manner.
I don't want to see Philadelphia. This is the farmer's neighbor.
Oh, believe me, I follow.
Is this color?
And really, again, on a surface level, this scene makes no sense whatsoever, does it? I mean, again, if you came to this not knowing anything about Twin Peaks and you just watched this scene, surely you would be like, what the fuck?
Well, weirdly, I don't know what this says about me. This bit actually made more sense to me.
Interesting.
Because I think this is one of the bits that actually works mainly for the fans of the show.
Yes.
Because this is the bit where actually it's the first time that Dale experiences or connects to this spiritual level, this spirit world, and these figures, you know, the one-armed man, Bob, Mike, the man from another place, all of these people who will then become huge parts of Twin Peaks, the actual show.
Yes.
If you're watching this for the first time without having seen the series, it makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah.
Because none of these characters are explained. They're not given names. You're just presumed to know who they are, or you just brush them off as kind of, you know, generic Lynchian weirdness. But if you're a fan of the show, then it does make sense, because essentially that's how then Dale almost, not supernaturally, but intuitively knows that this is something that exists in Twin Peaks, that these creatures, these spirits, these elements are to be listened to, and that they're not, you know, sort of haunting him, but that there's something and they are part of the mystery of Laura Palmer. And I think this is positioned in a way that is meant to kind of indicate that it's the first time perhaps that he connects with them.
Absolutely. I think that's true. And also, again, just from a pure sort of structural perspective, again, it feels a little bit like David Lynch setting up his clues before we get into the main drive of the plot. And he does this a little bit with Mulholland Drive, because, you know, I'm not spoiling anything in Mulholland Drive here, but he often said, you know, oh, the biggest clues to the answers behind Mulholland Drive come at the very, very beginning. And it's almost like he's doing that here with this. He's, you know, in the first sort of 20 minutes, he set up that this is going to be a procedural mystery where you are a detective and you need to look for clues. Then he takes us over to Philadelphia and he says, by the way, there is also some cosmic, weird, supernatural, psychological stuff going on here as well. There may be supernatural beings at play. There may be something strange going on with time or time loops. And he's kind of drip feeding us these little clues in the first 30 minutes as if to say, you know, what is this world we're in? Is this supernatural? Is this forensic and psychological? You kind of have to make up your own mind.
Absolutely. And also, it's all of those things that you listed.
Yeah, it is. It is. Exactly that.
And this case gives me a strange feeling. Not only has Special Agent Chester Desmond disappeared without a trace, but this is one of Cole's Blue Rose cases. The clues that were found by Special Agent Desmond and Agent Stanley have led to dead ends. The letter that was extracted from beneath the fingernail of Teresa Banks gives me the feeling that the killer will strike again. But like the song goes, who knows where or when?
So, finally then, I think it's 32 minutes into the running time, we arrive in Twin Peaks, the town, and we meet the character of Laura Palmer, played by Cheryl Lee. Let me just start off by asking you about her, because from this point onwards, it's her film, isn't it, really? What do you think of Cheryl Lee and how she plays Laura Palmer?
I love Laura Palmer, and I think I only really fell in love with her after this film.
Yes.
Because we don't really get to know her through the series. We just see glimpses and memories. And she's very interesting in the show because we build an idea of Laura Palmer through the way that people talk about her and the way that they mourn her. And obviously we find out more about her sort of double life, you know, as this sort of beloved, perfect cheerleader in her high school, like the prom queen, popular girl in school, super beautiful. Everybody wants to be Laura Palmer. Everybody wants to be with Laura Palmer, and incredibly troubled, but in a way that always seems like slightly superficial. It's like, oh, you know, she's got a double, darker life. But here we really go into her psychology, and Sheryl Lee gets so much material to play with. Her performance is incredible. She just goes all out. It's like she's breaking herself open in front of us. It's not dissimilar to the levels of intensity of Isabella Gianni in Possession, actually.
You're so right. It's that really kind of high, raw, intense performance that, again, some people, I think, kind of almost laughed at. I think it was kind of dismissed as a bad performance when it first came out and when it was first shown at Cannes, which is so sad because I agree with you. I think it is an incredible performance, and I can't believe that Sheryl Lee didn't get more accolades and didn't, I think it's the amount that she has to do in this and the amount of emotional turmoil her character has to go through. She's kind of mesmerizing too, isn't she?
Oh, absolutely. And well, I'm not that surprised because people don't like female performances that are too much.
That's interesting.
Think of Gina Rowlands. Gina Rowlands is one of the best actresses that ever graced the screen. And a lot of her performances that were claimed are sort of, quote unquote, too much. It's because we're not really, socially, we're not really conditioned to allow, to see women be raw and uncontrolled and unruly, even on screen, let alone in real life. But, I digress.
Fire, walk with me.
That's really interesting. You're right. And actually, maybe it's a good chance for me to ask you, Anna, I talked about this with Prano a bit about Blue Velvet, that some people talk about David Lynch, criticize David Lynch for the treatment of women in his films, that they are often objectified, that, there is an element of this film that could be construed as quite leery at times. There's a lot of teenage girls getting naked in bars and all of that kind of stuff, and as well as obviously all the murder and everything. How do you feel about that? What's your take on that?
It's a really big question, and it's difficult because it sort of varies film to film.
Yeah.
I think with focusing specifically in this one, it's visually quite different from Twin Peaks, the series, in the sense that, when obviously the limitations are different because this is a feature film, it's not a network TV show. So Lynch does allow himself to be a lot more leery and a lot more explicit. And, whether it's in, say, season 1 and season 2, especially, they sort of implied a lot of things that Laura was participating in, like her being a teenage sex worker, her doing a lot of drugs, going to all the weird places and just having sex with a lot of very different random men. All of those things we are told in the series, we're shown them here. But we're also continuously reminded of the fact that Laura is a teenage girl. I don't think it's necessarily leery because it's always tinged with sadness. It is so sad. It's a girl breaking down in slow motion. It's not sexy at all. And even when she's sort of performing this over-the-top sexiness, it's still sad because she's just letting herself be, putting herself in these situations that are hurting her because she's so traumatized and going through so much pain that she's not expressing or dealing with or communicating to anyone, and these kind of, and also sort of in touch with a weird cosmic spirit world that she's not quite sure whether it's an extension of her or whether it's a real thing, whether it's really happening. Obviously, nobody believes her who she tells about this. There's almost no one to tell. It's almost constantly sad if you think about the series, the fact that she never met someone like Dale Cooper who would have believed her and sort of maybe perhaps helped her navigate that particular world. And the fact that basically except James, all the men around her just want a piece of her, even the ones that are there supposedly to help her. And because of the, the trauma that unfolds in front of us and her being kind of a victim of abuse and incest, everything is sort of tinged with that tragedy of Laura. And I read this interesting thing that Lynch said about her, because you can really tell, like, this movie exists because he wanted to explore Laura's character more. That's the whole reason Fire Walk with Me exists. He's like, I'm done with Twin Peaks, but I'm not done with her yet. And he describes her in this really wonderful way where he said that she was radiant on the surface, but dying inside. And I just thought that was such a beautiful way of describing it, because she is, Sheryl Lee is like this beautiful portrait of an all-American girl, gorgeous, blonde, whatever. And she's suffering constantly in front of everyone and nobody can see. And it's so sad.
Do you think that if you were falling in space, that you would slow down after a while or go faster and faster? Faster and faster. And for a long time you wouldn't feel anything. And then you'd burst into fire. Forever. And the angels wouldn't help you. Because they've all gone away.
It's that everything looks glossy on the outside but is filled with pain and horror on the inside. It's that, and Lynch is obsessed with that idea, isn't he? And I agree with you. I think this is a sleazy world that we're in throughout the bulk of this film. It's an uncomfortable world, and it is filled with sleazy characters. But you're right. I don't think that the film is in any way titillating or sexy in that way, because I think it's just really disturbing and horrible and upsetting through most of it, isn't it? That's the thing. And I think that's testament to how good a character Laura Palmer is, and how well she's written and how well she's performed, that I think we empathize so much with her that this other stuff going on isn't titillating, isn't exciting. It's just sad. Like you said, it's sad and tragic. Yeah. So when we were first introduced to Laura Palmer, we've got that lovely little like Twin Peaksy montage as she walks around the town. She says hello to people. Let me just ask you very briefly about your thoughts. I just want a couple of your brief initial thoughts on some of these characters, some of the Twin Peaks faves. James Hurley, what do you think of him?
Oh, sweet summer child. He's such a little puffin.
He is, little puffin. Bobby Briggs.
Oh, Bobby's a prick. I love Bobby. Bobby's like a failed Beverly Hills 90210 character. I love it.
He is. Or like a T-Bird from Greece or something. Isn't he? Yeah. So good.
Bobby is like a domestic abuser in the making. It's, scary to see.
Very, very true. Donna. What about Donna? And obviously played by a different character, a different actress, right?
Yes, she's recast in this. She's played by Moira Kelly, where she was played by Lara Flynn Boyle in the series. Mm-hmm. And I always forget about that until I watched the film. I was like, oh, right, yeah, that happened.
Yeah.
Donna is innocent. She's very similar to James in that sense, where she's light. Whether Laura is filled with darkness and surrounds herself with darkness and has darkness thrust upon her. Donna is just innocent. She only sees the beautiful layers of her reality, which is also why there's a really, I hope we get to talk about this later, there's a really interesting scene between them that I think kind of illustrates that and really digs into the relationship between Donna and Laura a little bit more.
I think Donna actually has a really interesting role to play in this particular film. I mean, even more interesting than she is in the TV show, to be honest, I would say. And finally, what about Leland and Sarah, Laura's parents, and played by Ray Wise and Grace Zabriskie? What are your thoughts on these two?
Well, I think Leland gains a lot of layers, and they're not pretty.
Yeah.
And he is a really dark character. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the really interesting things about him in this film is that, in the series we see him as a grieving father, but now especially if you're coming in knowing what he's done, you see the darkness before you see kind of the superficial niceties first.
Yes.
And then that becomes quite chilling. And then the more you find out about Laura and what's been happening to her, the darker the reality becomes. So then every single movement he does every time we see him on screen, it's always quite chilling because it's always filled with menace as opposed to being sympathetic towards him.
Yeah, 100% agree. And we'll have more to say about Leland as it goes on. But let me ask you about, I guess this is the first absolutely terrifying moment in this film, which is where she realizes that some of her pages from her diary have gone missing, and she goes home in the middle of the day. The ceiling fan is on. There's something weird happening in her house. She walks up those stairs, walks into her bedroom, and we see Bob kind of crouched behind her drawers like he's looking for something or like he's found something. It's almost a kind of jump scare moment, isn't it? That to me is one of the scariest moments in horror cinema for me. But let me just start off by asking you the basic question of, how is this film for you as a horror film? Is this an effective horror film in your opinion?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because there was something really cool you mentioned before, that I think this film sits in that art house horror niche.
Yes.
That doesn't work for everyone.
Yes.
But I live in that niche.
Me too.
So this is perfect for me.
Yeah.
You know, this is art house, this is horror. It's not kind of conventional horror. And it's on the weirder spectrum of art house cinema. But that is exactly my jam. And I love living in that little Venn diagram.
Yeah.
Where, you know, Lynch also lives. But yeah, I think it does work as a horror film, but it's you know, like I've just mentioned, it's very art house in its sensibilities, and the horror of it is very internal as opposed to jump scary. You know, there's nothing really that, you know, everything is horrifying, but you have to really feel very strongly for Laura to find it horrifying, because you're essentially seeing the degradation of a human being in front of you. That's the horror of it.
Yes.
It's not jump scares. It's not really Bob. It's not really any cosmic threats. It's the human horror of someone being abused consistently for years and years and then breaking down.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And actually, that you're right, because that idea is the scariest part of this film. But actually, even on a superficial level, I do think there are a couple of moments, like that moment for me when Bob is suddenly crouched in the corner. That is creepy, right? In the kind of classic uncanny horror sense. I mean, Bob is a scary looking man.
Listen, any man that is like hiding behind your dresser or at the foot of your bed is a terrifying image. So yes, it's horrifying. No, it's really scary. There are, you're right, a couple of scenes in the film, that one, and also there's a scene in the club which is quite scary, and then obviously the last scene I found very disturbing. Even now, like, I've seen it a bunch of times, and it's both very kind of beautifully and intensely shot and also incredibly scary.
Yes, I agree. Bob himself then, I mean, this is the moment when, you know, Laura sees Bob, she runs outside scared, and then Leland exits the house and she sort of goes, no, it can't be him, and this is where it introduces this idea that they are one and the same person, right? Leland is Bob is Leland, and this has kind of been touched upon in the TV show. How do you interpret this film? Is this really a supernatural entity possessing Leland? Is this just how she views her abuser? What do you think is going on in this film, in your opinion?
So I think there's many ways of reading a Lynch film, but the way that the two main ones that I can see here are obviously there is a supernatural element to it. It's much more explored in the series, but essentially, you know, the idea is that Bob is a demonic force. A spirit or a demon or something kind of supernatural that possesses Leland, and that is the reason why Leland hurts his daughter.
Yes.
Or, and I actually prefer this second reading, is that this is one of the ways that Laura deals with her abuse, is the fact that it's too difficult to grasp the idea that her own dad would abuse her consistently and hurt her so much. So it's much easier to almost disassociate and imagine and see this other scary, random, unknown man, that is her abuse as opposed to her father. And then when the disassociation stops and she starts, you know, seen Leland instead of Bob, in the situation where she's just seen Bob, she starts to really understand what's really been happening.
Yes.
And that becomes part of the reason of her undoing. It's because it's too much to wrap her head around, especially because she's extremely isolated. She's doing a lot of drugs. She's putting herself in really continuously abusive situations over and over again. So she's almost kind of punishing herself because of the kind of the trauma of the stuff that she's been subjected to.
Yeah.
And part of that is kind of this idea of, I cannot deal with the fact that it's the person that's supposed to be protecting me and who's supposed to be my, you know, family member and is supposed to love and nurture me, and instead is abusing me and also forcing me into the situation of almost breaking away from reality.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer that reading because I think it's more psychologically interesting and gives Laura a lot of depth, and it kind of illustrates, it makes visible the way that she's dealing with her trauma.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I prefer that reading as well, and I think anybody can make whatever they want of it. But I love this idea that it's her almost inventing this monster that her dad becomes when that stuff happens to her, you know, and that they are two different people, but ultimately they're not really two different people. And you know, whether it's actually in the story, whether it's kind of supernatural or not, it doesn't really matter, because it feels like in my head, the way I read it is that it's almost like this is Laura telling her own story, and in her story, he's this evil spirit presence that is taking over her dad, or whatever it is that she, you know, believes to deal with it, essentially. Because
I love that.
It's a horrible thing, isn't it? It's a truly you know, the heart of this film, and this is the strange thing about Twin Peaks, and this is the strange thing about Lynch, is that it can be jarring for some people, because even in Twin Peaks the show, in amongst all of this wacky comedy and, you know, cherry pies and cups of coffee, there is this story about this girl this story of incest and abuse and rape and like all of this stuff that's been going on to this teenage girl for years. And yeah, that is a really difficult thing, I think, to explore in a film, and not make it just completely unwatchable in a sense. But yeah, I think by using that kind of like slightly more supernatural mythology in some way to kind of deal with it is a really fascinating way to do it.
These hands are filthy. Look. There's dirt way under this fingernail.
You know, what I love as well is that you have both these men they're both monstrous and they're both terrifying in different ways, right? I mean, Ray Wise is kind of just as scary as Leland as Frank Silver is as Bob, in a way. And everyone always talks about Bob being this terrifying character, you know, the scariest thing in Twin Peaks. But I think Leland's pretty fucking scary in this too.
Yeah, just terrifying in different ways, because Bob Silver is kind of, you know, shaggy haired and sort of is playing up the terrifying aspects of him, and he's got like a really intense face and gaze. And whereas Ray Wise is a lot more, you know, he looks on the surface like an upstanding citizen, a model father, but we know what he's doing, and that makes it chilling.
Yeah, you're right, actually. Even the way they look is interesting, isn't it? It's like a kind of ego versus an id of themselves, because Bob is so dirty and long hair and scruffy and grimy, and then Leland is so well dressed and well groomed and well to do and everything, and behaves very politely most of the time as well, doesn't he? But there are those moments, and some of also the most really insidious moments, aren't they, are moments around the dinner table when Leland is like looking at Laura's fingernails and that kind of stuff. That is some of the really kind of intense horror, isn't it, that you get in this film that we've not seen before in Twin Peaks, right?
Yeah, it's gruesome, because we kind of see the way that he looks at her and the way that he wants to control her and groom her. And it's really icky. Like we don't want to be that close to that level of, I'm struggling to find a word. So it's really hard to look abuse in the face.
Yes.
And it's really hard to look abusers in the face, especially when they're camouflaging in plain sight.
Yeah.
Hiding in plain sight. Sorry, that's the expression I'm looking for.
Yes.
And kind of those details, once you know what's been going on, when he zeroes in on those things, everything kind of gains another layer of creepiness. It's not just, her dad telling her off for having dirty fingernails. It's the way that he's looking at her. And I think one of the things that this film makes really interesting about Leland, and particularly kind of in the relationship with Bob and stuff, is that actually those are the scenes that, at least in the way that I read it, show us that this whole I was possessed by Bob the evil demon spirit is not the reason why Leland kills her.
Yeah.
That abuse has been going on for years. That's him. That's not Bob.
Exactly.
And the series kind of, excuses him, quote unquote, because he's, possessed by Bob and that's why he killed Laura. It's like, actually, no, it's a bit more complicated than that. And it's a lot darker than a demon spirit possessed my dad and my dad killed me.
Yeah, you're so right. That little dinner table, dining room sequence tells us all of that. You're right. Within that small scene, the way that Sarah reacts to it as this wife and mother who clearly has endured this as well for years, and kind of, you get the feeling that she sort of knows what's going on but doesn't want to acknowledge it, right? There is this feeling of like, how aware/unaware is Sarah through this whole ordeal? She smokes loads, she drinks loads, and it's almost like, she's escaping it herself, isn't she, in some way? And you're right, he's not being Bob there. He's not being like super evil, animalistic, feral Bob. He's just being this very sinister, insidious, abusive dad. Yeah. And then there is that other really interesting moment as well, and Ray Wise is so good, because then later he goes to bed and he starts crying in front of the mirror, doesn't he? And then he goes in and says to Laura, "I'm sorry, I love you," and all of that. And again, there is that duality to his personality, but it's very real, I think, isn't it? It feels believable. It's horrible.
Yeah, it's horrible. Props to him, because that is not a pretty role.
I love you. I love you so much.
And of course, during all this, we also have these classic Twin Peaksy Lynchian elements of dream sequences, right? There's this insane scene where she hangs a picture on her wall. She goes into the red room. We see the little man. There's talk of he is the arm, and there's all this other stuff that goes on.
Yes.
There's a moment when she has a vision of Heather Graham in her bed, which to people that don't know the TV show is completely bonkers. How do you think that stuff fits into this story of Laura Palmer, all of that red room madness?
Well, I kind of love it because it harkens back to the series, but I think it exists well within just the narrative of the film.
Yeah.
Obviously, everything is incredibly layered and super, super dense, and I don't at all think that I understand all of the layers of it, because I'd have to live in Lynch's brain to be able to do that. But I think what's really established well is that, yes, this is all about real life abuse and trauma, but there is also a spiritual and cosmic level.
Yeah.
And Laura is attuned to that. And, you could argue perhaps that she's attuned to that because of the fact that she is in so much pain and so isolated. But perhaps there is kind of a particular disposition that she has, that Dale Cooper also has. And it harkens back to kind of that very strange first 30 minutes, but also it adds another layer of weirdness that exists in Twin Peaks. So for anyone who's not seen the show, it kind of introduces the idea that there are supernatural goings on in this universe, and there are supernatural kind of layers to Twin Peaks as well. And Laura has access to them. The thing that makes it scary is that she doesn't get them, and we don't necessarily get them as an audience either, which adds to the really scary confusion of it. It's like, and it's never really fully tied together.
Yes.
in many ways, which also then kind of adds, it constantly keeps you questioning, constantly keeps you kind of actively watching and trying to understand. And it also kind of adds to this intense isolation of Laura, of like, why is she the one experiencing these visions? Why is she the only one seeing these creatures? Why is she seeing Bob? Why is she seeing Annie Blackburn in her bed? Like, all of these things, like, it's just adds to, she's already going through so much.
Mm-hmm.
Now she is in touch with a whole nother realm of reality and seeing corpses in her bed. Like, give a girl a break.
I know, right? It's so much to deal with for Laura and for us as an audience, I think. And you're right. I think there is all of that element there, that there is this spiritual realm here that's present. And also, what I love about it is that the most recent time I watched it, I was thinking about this almost in a psychological level too, of in the way that she could potentially have invented this Bob character. She could have almost invented this other world for herself to escape into, in a way, almost in that kind of like, Pan's Labyrinth-esque kind of, let me escape into my own fantasy realm, and because there's that picture she has on the wall of the angels, and she constantly looks at those angels like she wants them there with her, and I think it's the same with this other picture she hangs on the wall that she then goes into, and this world of other people that help her process what's happening to her, maybe in some way.
Oh, I love it. I love that reading.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It doesn't completely add up, because also Annie Blackburn, how would she be in that vision? But anyway, it's a really interesting, and again, there's nothing, you can never make complete sense of one interpretation or another, but I think it's all there for people to kind of read into how they want, isn't it, I think? Okay, at this point in the episode, we're going to move over to our new regular segment, Wild About Horror. Let's hear what Freudian cinephile Mary Wild makes of David Lynch's Fire Walk With Me.
Hey Mike, it's Mary Wild, and today I'm going to run through some ideas related to David Lynch's emotionally ensnaring film Twin Peaks: Fire Walk With Me, which depicts the last days in the life of the popular high school student Laura Palmer. Laura is troubled, addicted to cocaine and cheating on her boyfriend. She discovers that pages are missing from her secret diary and has a dream about entering the Black Lodge. An atmosphere of pure horror and confusion grows around her. She embarks on a life of promiscuity with random men and becomes distraught when Donna tries to follow suit. Laura doesn't want her friend to become like her. One night, Bob comes through Laura's window to sexually assault her, only to transform into Leland Palmer. The knowledge that her own father is her rapist is overwhelmingly painful, setting off a chain of events that leads to her death, wrapped in plastic, dumped in the lake. Lynch wanted to make a Twin Peaks film at the time because he couldn't get himself to leave that world after the TV show. He said he was in love with the character of Laura Palmer and all her contradictions, radiant on the surface but dying inside. According to Lynch, the movie is about the loneliness, shame, guilt, confusion, and devastation of the incest victim. It also dealt with the torment of the father, the war within him. Bob is without a doubt a physical embodiment of trauma, the debilitating effect it has on the body and on the mind. Bob tells Laura that he intends to possess her. Trauma here is given a voice, anthropomorphized, expressing the intent to replace Laura's personhood with an all-consuming evil fear, erasing her subjectivity. Laura is surprised when it occurs to her that Bob had been her father Leland all along, but perhaps her mind needed to generate a different representation of him in order not to completely crush her. Bob is an avatar of the unimaginable destruction humans are capable of, the exploitative thing that creeps into our room at night, catching us at our most vulnerable, the sleep paralysis demon, the boogeyman. Much of what we see in Fire Walk With Me maps out Laura's experiential reality. It's a terrifying topography of her anxious internal life, perpetually either on the brink of a panic attack or in the throes of it, and how this contrasts sharply with her glamorous homecoming queen public persona. Laura's screams remind me of the Munch painting, an isolated figure responding desperately to an existential threat, without any hope of liberation or resolution. The film reveals how trauma can cause us to behave in irrational ways, the paradox of becoming attracted to the very origins of what has harmed us, and the compulsion to inflict it upon ourselves. The sexual abuse Laura suffers reduces her sense of self. Her potential to overcome it disappears as she seems to seek out the very thing that perpetuates the trauma, becoming involved in reckless sexual encounters with men who punish and degrade her. Her friend Donna tearfully begs to understand, why does Laura do it? Why doesn't she just do the opposite, seek help, take steps to get better? One way to approach this predicament is an explanation offered by Sigmund Freud in his 1914 paper, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through. The idea that the traumatic event has to be repressed because it's too heavy to hold in the conscious mind, but that some part of us still longs to engage with it. The individual does not remember the event, so they act it out without knowing they are repeating it. This is exactly what Laura is doing. She's caught in a deadlock of feeling compelled to reenact the abuse. Some part of her thinks this might give her closure, but until she fully confronts the horror of the trauma head on, closing the door on this chapter is unfortunately not possible. Laura is thus relegated to an undefined limbo state, the Black Lodge, where she is free from Bob's threat of possession, but also unable to move to another realm, not yet at peace. Therein lies the tragedy of the Twin Peaks story, and the role of Agent Dale Cooper in the position of the detective psychoanalyst, to retrace the steps of the murder and resolve the mystery on Laura's behalf, and hopefully set them both free in the process. Until next time.
A big thank you there to the wonderful Mary Wilde. And don't forget, if you want to hear more of Mary, you can sign up to her courses. All of the details of that will be on her Twitter. You can follow her at PsychStar. And also Mary has her own podcast, the Projections Podcast with Sarah Cleaver. And you can find that in all the normal places where you get your podcasts. Okay, let's continue with our discussion of Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me.
Who are you? Who are you? Who are you? Who are you?
So the film, just seems to get darker and darker and darker in the second half, and we get to this sort of peak gross moment, I suppose, where Bob is having sex with Laura and she's saying, who are you? Who are you? Like, she still doesn't quite know, or she hasn't quite accepted yet who that is. And then there is the realization when she screams, when she sees that it is her father having sex with her. And it's such a sad and shocking and disturbing moment. And then we're pretty much at the end. After that, it's her last day. And it's interesting, the different stages that Laura goes through across this last 7 days of her life. It's almost like stages of grief, right? There's kind of denial and there's anger. And then here there is a kind of acceptance. There's a resignation, this feeling that she knows this is the end for her. Maybe because she's finally sort of accepted that it's her dad doing this stuff to her. And then we finally get into that incredible end sequence with the murder itself. Now, of course, we all knew this murder was coming, right? We all knew this was what this film was going to be. This is how Laura Palmer died. So, how did that affect this scene for you? Did that take away its power that you knew it was coming? Did it add something?
I mean, for me, it kind of added to it because it adds the sense of dread, because we're basically seeing a dead girl walking.
Yeah.
And the fact that we get to know her and we get to understand her and we get to feel the stuff that she's going through, it just makes it makes her murder so much sadder. And the fact that we see the fact that it's so horrific and violent, and that she's entirely helpless, and that the fact that she is murdered by her dad, not by Bob, she's murdered by Leland.
Yes.
Is tragic. It's really tragic, and it is horrifying. And I love the way that sequence is shot because it emphasizes the horror. It is not titillating. It is not pretty. It doesn't fall into a lot of sort of I think horror traps of just wanting to see beautiful women murdered.
Yeah.
It's horrifying because you see a lot of the fear that she must be going through. And I think the way that it's filmed, the way that it's edited with kind of this strobe lighting and kind of almost still images, we don't really get a lot of movement. It's sort of like it's very quickly edited, but it's almost like very darkly, grotesquely beautiful images that are edited in quick succession, almost like a God, what's the name for these kind of like a photo montage almost, as opposed to a film sequence. And the music, it all functions to create this really almost stab-like effect. You almost feel like you're being stabbed as an audience member because you're seeing these images that are really intensely graphic and violent. And you don't see a lot of them, but you sort of get so many of them in quick succession that it feels like you're just being bombarded by the feeling of the murder. You're not really quite sure what's going on. You're not getting the full picture. You're getting these really close-up brushstrokes of Laura's murder. And I think that really, again, is coming almost from her point of view, as opposed to from a wider point of view of seeing her being massacred by her dad. And, it's sort of reminded me of the way that her body is found, wrapped up in plastic in the lake in Twin Peaks. It's not as clean and, horrific because it is a corpse of a young girl, but this really emphasizes the horror. It's not sort of this, superficially, oh my God, a beautiful young girl is dead, we must solve it because this is a tragedy. It's like, this is a horrifying act, and let me show you exactly how horrifying it is. Let's take away the genre romanticizing of this dead girl. It's not, the start of a murder mystery. It's a fucking murder, and you're gonna feel it.
That is so right, isn't it? It really makes you... It's what's so clever about it is because you're right, it's horrific, it's jarring, it's operatic, it's loud. And then we have that shot that I think is actually just taken from the TV show where we see the body wrapped in plastic lying on the ground the next morning. And it's this sudden jarring reminder that, like, oh yeah, all of this pain and suffering of this teenage girl you've just watched for the last 2 hours, that's the setup to a fun, kooky TV show network mystery program that everyone loved. And it suddenly hits home that... And I think this is the point that David Lynch always wanted to make. It's why he centered a whole TV mystery around this one victim. That it's that idea that this one murder is so important and it creates this wave of sadness and this rift of shock across this entire town, that it shouldn't just be a disposable thing or a body count number or anything like that, like a first victim, second victim. It's like, this is a person that we need to learn more about, kind of thing. And I think, that end sequence does that in such a clever way, because it shows you that horrific murder and then it ends with almost like we're stepping into the pilot of Twin Peaks, but you can look at it in a very different way, I think.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. And then we have the crazy Red Room ending in which Laura is sat laughing. There's an angel there. Again, incredibly cheesy. Apparently a lot of people laughed at this in Cannes. It's very over the top, I suppose, in many ways. That kind of like very kind of stereotypical angel floating above her as she laughs and cries. What did you think of that ending?
I didn't think it was cheesy. I thought it was very sad. And again, I mean, I have no idea what 1992 Cannes was like, but
really mean, apparently.
I mean, Cannes is always mean, but I think there is something to be said, kind of just to contextualize, is those festivals, especially festivals like Cannes, which are premiere festivals where something is being seen for the first time, there's a lot of pressure, are everybody's in a really intense situation and everybody's very prone to gut reactions being extremely over the top. You know, if you love something, you love it. Oh my God, it's the best thing I've ever seen in my life. If you hate something, it's like, this is the worst thing ever. Lynch is the worst director that ever lived. Don't want to see another movie by him, blah, blah, blah. So like, I always take sort of film festival reactions with a little grain of salt because it is extremely heightened situations and not everything is kind of seen with a level head or with enough sleep.
Yes, you're so right. Yeah.
But I found it quite sad. I found it almost like... It's interesting that Laura, I don't know whether to think that her sort of suffering in life is extended by her becoming a part of this... by her becoming one of the spirits or one of the beings that sort of trapped or maybe continuing their existence in this red room, that she has to then, you know, watch her murder kind of attempt to be solved and people picking apart and learning about everything about her that there was, not just the superficial bits. And perhaps that she just wanted to not be, and she's sort of forced to exist in that weird room, and it's sad because she's just never gonna be able to escape.
So there you go. I mean, there's so much more we probably could have touched upon in this film. I mean, there's a whole subplot involving Bobby shooting someone in the woods. There's so much stuff in this film. We haven't really got enough time to cover it all. Let me ask you, you know, as we've talked about, this film was not well received when it first came out. Do you think that public opinion of it and critical opinion of it has changed over the last 30 years?
Yes, 100%. Yeah, and I think, you know, even Twin Peaks as a whole, the way that it's considered critically and the way that the public has interacted with it has also changed because of our wider changed, I should say, relationship to television.
Yeah.
And also just because of physical media and because of streaming and because of accessibility. Like, people can now, I think there's a much larger culture of rewatching. And I think Twin Peaks and Lynch films in general benefit hugely from rewatching because they're so layered and so textured, and you know, you cannot get all of it in just one watch. There's just too much going on in any given scene, and I think that has helped a lot of people, both audiences and sort of online critics and the critical community, kind of really reappreciate, reconsider, and also just our relationship with screen media has significantly changed over the last, even couple of years, but over the last 10 years. So that, I think, has played a huge part in the way that we talk and interpret Twin Peaks and Fire Walk with Me. Yeah,
100% agree. And I love that it's this idea of, you know, especially as horror fans, it's like, you know those millions of horror films you've seen, whether it's slasher movies or forensic movies. What if one of those victims had an entire film made about herself? And then how would that change your perception of that faceless, nameless victim, you know? And it's a really cool idea. Amazing. Anna, thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about this bonkers, baffling film.
Always a pleasure. You asked me to talk about the weirdest films. I love it.
I love it.
Keep them coming.
Yes. Where can people find more of your work and your podcast out there on the world?
So I am on Twitter at Anna B Demented, and that's mostly just me retweeting TikToks of cats doing fun stuff. Not that much film content, but I also host the Final Girls podcast, and we're doing our season on female monsters. So there's a lot of really gross films happening. And also I co-host The Next Supremes with Clarice Lockery, which is our rewatch of American Horror Story, and we're currently on Asylum, which also has a lot of aliens and really gross shit happening.
Yes, so good. Anna, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guests, Mary Wild, Anna Bogutskaya, and the amazing Kelli Weston. So, what do you think of this week's fascinating films, Dead Ringers and Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me? I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Letterboxd. And if you're a Twin Peaks fan and you want to hear extra additional Fire Walk With Me chat, there is actually an extended version of that episode about Fire Walk With Me that is nearly 2 hours long just on that one film, and that is available for $10 patrons. So head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror, and if you're able to join as a $10 donor, you'll get access to that and the rest of our Twin Peaks miniseries. You can find all previous episodes of this podcast on our website. Simply head on over to evolutionofhorror.com. We also have a YouTube channel, EOH TV. That's where you can find reviews of new releases, festival coverage, interviews and video essays. That's youtube.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms. Please subscribe to us, and if you get a chance, if you get a spare minute, please drop us a little rating or review on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, next time we've got another wonderful double bill for you. If these two movies were on the more psychological end, then next time we're going back into full-blown grotesque body horror. Next time I'm going to be joined by two guests, Lou Thomas and Michael Blythe. We're going to be discussing Tetsuo the Iron Man from 1989 and Brian Usner's Society from the same year. Cannot wait. Join us then for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.